you know.
Or if there is a male there, it's the you know, as it was when I was a kid, the modelling that you got from your dad was the stuff that sort of caused you problems later on in life.
Yep, absolutely. Very good. Well, that's probably a good little introduction to what the next 45 minutes to an hour is going to be like anyway. So today, welcome back to another episode of Musings. I have the mic on the mic.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, as I said before, the Musings conversations, we'll just pull up a topic and then pull it apart and we will get to wherever we get to from there. But before I do that, I'd love you to give yourself a bit of an introduction so that you can give us a bit of a background story that'll lead into what we're obviously going to be talking about today.
Sure. Look, I obviously my real name is Michael, known as Mongo around the traps, or Old Man Mike. I'm 57. I was born in Switzerland, came to Australia as a young guy. Dad was looking for a new life here in the colonies. And Dad was a very much old school idea of what it was to be a man, you know, that work hard, play hard, fight hard, drink hard, everything was hard. Very little emotion. In fact, I've often been caused to, I guess, reflect on whether ever I heard him tell me he loved me, and I don't remember him ever saying that to me. But he was pretty quick with a hand, pretty quick with a belt, particularly in those early teenage years. One day he told me that I would never amount to anything better than a street sweeper. I was about 12 years old at the time, and that was something that then drove me for most of my adult life, because I had no self-worth, no self-confidence as a young fella. And I decided that the way to protect myself from what the world had to offer was to start to embark on this idea, this path of hypermasculinity. So it was about building myself up physically. It was about building emotional barriers around me to protect myself from the outside world. So I became quite hard outwardly, emotionally. Obviously built myself up physically because I figured if I was a big bloke, I was not going to be hassled by other guys, and that certainly panned out well. I played contact sports. I joined the Navy when I was 15, partly to get away from home. In the Navy, I again, hit the gym, built myself up. In my younger years, my 20s, I spent time in my spare time working as a bouncer, because that was, again, being this hard guy that other guys feared and women wanted to be with, sort of thing. And then I ended up at war in 2003, 2004. I went to Iraq. I spent 6 months in Baghdad, and I was the warrior. I have a little smile sometimes when I see the narratives around about, the warrior culture that is prevalent certainly in our sport. But I was at war. I was wearing body armor. I was carrying a weapon. I was the man.
Yeah, you were doing the thing.
Yeah. And I came back from that, and the wheels started to fall off. I'd always had these kind of depressive episodes when I was a young kid. Every 6 months or so, I'd find a little hole to curl up in, have a cry, drink my concrete. I'd be good again. But when I came back from Iraq, I found myself really angry and sad at the same time, and I started to drink a fair bit. My clean eating meant that I'd have a bit of fruit on my pizza rather than just the pizza itself. I was drinking a lot. Pineapple. Yep. I know it's a sin. It is. And I found myself one day with my wife, and I lost my temper over something she'd asked me to do. And I started punching into the wall of the house. And I kind of turned around to say something to her, and Catherine was looking at me, she was looking at me in fear. She wasn't sure if I was going to hurt her or hurt myself. And I realised that this idea of being a man was a chimera. It was a mirage. It was something that, the idea that we can handle everything just wasn't working. At least it wasn't working for me. So I went to a doc, and they sent me to a psychiatrist, and psychiatrist said, lie down on the couch and tell me how you feel about stuff. And I said, I can't, because I don't, I don't feel, I'm just empty, I'm just angry. So that didn't work out for me too well, and I you see it in movies, I went the prescribed number of sessions, and I got signed off, and I went back, drank my concrete, carried on. And it wasn't until my mother-in-law died about 4 years later that the wheels really fell off my little wagon. My mother-in-law lived in the UK, so we had planned an annual trip there. And rather than the joyous holiday over Christmas, we ended up, burying her and putting her affairs dressed, etc., etc.
Yep.
I came back from there. 2 days after we got back to home, I had to go interstate for 12 months to do a training course. I was still in the Navy at the time. And so my wife and I never had time to decompress. We then played this game that human beings do. Everything's okay. Thumbs up, stiff upper lip, carry on. And over the first half of 2008, I started to spiral down, and I found myself around mid-year just really considering hard taking myself out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, of course. Came back here. I removed myself from course, came back here, and did something that, we blokes aren't really taught to do too well, and that was started talking to somebody about what was going on. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, got matched up with a counsellor who helped me to start exploring myself. Who was I? Where were these emotions coming from? What was causing me to feel about the way I did, look at the world the way I did, and how could I do that in a different way that would be much more constructive? So I did that. That started in 2009, and since then I've been, I guess, on this continuous path of understanding me, my place in the world, how I relate to the world, and starting to understand more about the pressures that I faced as a young guy trying to be a man, and how hard that expectation, or the impact of that expectation on me as a young man, but also the impact that expectation that is still around, I can see daily in the work I do now. Now, I left the Navy 6 years ago. I retired 4 years ago, and I now work with a local charity talking to young guys about my experiences in life, as a way to help them have an easier path than the one I had.
So a very interesting story. I think there's I don't know if we have enough time today to really get into all the things we could get into. I suppose I have a lot of questions in relation to that as it is, and I think we'll probably just cover that off as we go through, because there's a lot of things, such as obviously the relationship you have with your father. That's something that I think a lot of people can relate to, in different variations of that. And then it's also then the transition into something that does give you a rites of passage, such as the Navy. But then the rites of passage is also almost like a false rites of passage, because it feels real because there's boxes to tick and I'm manly doing so. However, you come out the other side and you're like, I don't feel like I'm any different. I'm assuming that's what I've spoken to people, is that on the outside, I'm different, but on the inside, they're like, fuck, I can't admit to anyone that I don't feel any different.
No, and this is really, is part of these masks and defences that we all wear. Is, I don't think we grow as we get older, and we grow as we experience stuff, but deep inside, we're still the fundamental us, and, we show different faces to the different worlds that we inhabit. The face we show our loved ones, the face we show people we know socially, the face we show people at work. And definitely, there are a lot of guys and women who I've known in the Defence Force that have been irretrievably changed by their experiences, become changed people. But at the same time, I think there are, the majority who are still who they are, but it's these barriers and these masks that we show that hide what's behind.
Well, it's dogma. And the dogma is like the lies that we tell ourselves because of the people that told us those lies, because they were lies that they told themselves.
Yes.
But how do we know they're lies? That's the thing, because we think that because we think it, therefore it's true, therefore then, I must act that out. It becomes a belief. And it's interesting. I would have a conversation. I do a fair bit of mentoring as it is anyway. And also I know to speak. I know to talk through my issues and things I find difficult. And the amount of times it's sort of like, somebody would be like, oh, but I think this, and I'm like, okay, when did that first thought actually occur? Yeah. And they're like, well, it's been like that forever, and I'm like, before you could talk. Yeah. Like, they had to come at some point. They're like, okay, well, I remember being told that a lot when I was younger. It's like, so it was somebody else's thought that they said to you that you hear in your head, and you've heard it so many times that you now label it with your voice, and now it's your thought.
Absolutely, mate. I mean, this is, we talked before about my dad when I was about 12 or 13 years old, telling me that I would never amount to anything. I would never be anything better than a street sweeper. Now, I called him on that on his deathbed, and I'd come back. I was in Hong Kong at the time. He'd contracted cancer, and I came back. They sent me back, and I was there in uniform, my officer's uniform, gold braid on my shoulders and stuff. And I said, "So, what do you think of the street sweeper?" And he kind of looked at me with a puzzled face, and he said, well, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, do you remember when I was young you told me this?" And he said, "No." Now, whether he did or not is irrelevant. What he could never have understood or even expected, I think, was the impact that one sentence had on me, the way I felt about myself, and how it drove me to be this person I thought he wanted me to be.
Yeah. It's funny because I remember reading this story a number of years ago now, and there was this reporter, this journalist, found out that there was these two brothers, right? And one was a Fortune 500 CEO, and the other one was a drug addict on the streets, or a recovering drug addict, depending on which cycle that he was in. And so he went about interviewing both of them. It's a pretty polarizing story. So one's deemed in Western civilization as very successful. The other one's deemed in Western civilization as not very successful. So let's have a look. And he actually asked the same questions effectively. And he gets to the end and he's talking to the CEO, and he gets to the end and he goes, "Why do you think you are who you are today?" Right? And he doesn't drink, and he's a very successful person. And his father was an abusive alcoholic. And so he goes, "With a father like mine, how could I not?"
Yep.
And then when he interviews the brother, you can see where the story's going.
Yeah,
He interviews the brother, and the same thing, and he gets to the end, he goes, "Why do you think you are who you are today?" And he goes, "With a father like mine, how could I not?"
Yes.
And it's just it's the beautiful idea that we get to choose our response. That doesn't make it, "Oh, okay, sick, I'll go do that now." There's a process like anything else that we have to do in our life. But the reality is that to those situations, we do get to choose our response, because your option, rather than what you did, your other option was being the street sweeper.
Yep. And I think that comes down to a lot of, it's the choice, that word you used. I talk a lot with the young guys with this program that I run about decisions, responsibilities, accountabilities. You can take an easy way out and say, "That wasn't my fault. You did something. That wasn't my fault." Yeah, it was. You made a choice. Nobody's holding a gun to your head. You made a choice. Now, the fact that choice ended up in a bad outcome, you now have another choice. Do you learn from that outcome, or do you not learn from that outcome? Learn from the outcome is a more positive outcome.
Sure.
Then you can grow and you can be a better person. You won't make that mistake again. But it does come down to decisions. You need to be accountable, and I think that's part of talking about the topic we're talking about. That's one of the key elements of being an adult, but I think also of being a man, is that you are accountable for your decisions. And if you do something wrong, you make up for that. If you do something right, then also recognise that, because that's something you can hang your hat on in future.
That's where you build your character on. Absolutely. It's one of the biggest lessons I had to learn was that I get to choose my actions. I don't get to choose the consequences of those actions.
No.
And it was like, I remember even going through some things with business, remembering that if I had a fallout with a business partner, and I could sit there and blame, and then it occurred to me, as long as I blame, I can't grow.
Yep.
Like, he played a role, I played a role. What was my responsibility, the things that I had the ability to respond to in this situation? And then I recognized, and I'm very fortunate that I did go through those hardships in business. I've got plenty more to come, no doubt. Like, it'd be silly to think not.
Yep.
Right? And it was something that I recognized. It's like, okay, if I blame him for this situation, I don't get to grow from it.
Yep.
And I'm not going to let him steal my growth.
Exactly.
And so from that process, it was really interesting allowing myself to go, okay, well, I don't want to take responsibility for this, but what can I take responsibility for if I remove, my ego, if you want to call it that, and look at it all. Mark Manson, in his book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, he put it really simply, and I think it's something that was like, oh, I get that, which was, it may not be your fault, but now it's your responsibility.
Yeah.
And as adults, and I think this is a big thing for men, well, young adult males, is probably because some of them aren't men yet. And that's not to demasculate them, or emasculate them rather. It's just to go, there is a certain makeup that allows us to be positive male role models, and maybe we're not there yet, and I wasn't for a long time. And so it was understanding that there are certain things that happen in our childhood, and I say that as a global that wasn't our fault. I mean, like, there's certain things that were just out of our control.
Yep.
And that's fine. But now as an adult, it's my responsibility to do what I can to correct that within me and ensure that it doesn't happen again outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the the idea that there comes a time where if something that you've done has wronged somebody else, acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And I've just recently come to an epiphany that some decisions that I made in my early 20s, where I really hurt some people, one of whom is very close to me now, that I'd never actually said the words "I'm sorry." We sort of talked about, blah, this stuff happened and, you can't change history. But I'd never actually just sat down and said, however it happened, I know that what I did hurt you and I just want you to know how sorry I am for that. And that was almost like a confessional sort of thing for me. But I would like to think that it maybe did something positive for them as well. Just acknowledgement that they were hurt and the person who hurt them owned it. And I think that's something that, again, is another mark of maturity. Absolutely agree with you with regard to a man. I mean, I know a lot of guys my age and older who I wouldn't consider men. They're just boys.
Yeah.
And a lot of young guys, late teens, early 20s, who I would think are already men because of the way that they carry themselves and interact with the rest of the world. Yeah.
I read a line today, which said, "Women mature, men get older." And I was like, that's really interesting. And obviously it's men clearly mature, and that was one of the biggest things. I look at similar to what you're talking about, and in my early 20s, that I hurt a lot of people, and that was a lot out of my own insecurities. But that's not an excuse.
No,
that might be a part of the recipe for the occurrences. But it's not like, well, I just had things on, and you just got in the way.
Yeah,
it's like, actually, you fucked up.
Yep.
And maturity, I believe, is the ability to be able to identify that and accept your role within that. And it's not a matter of like everything goes back to being rosy, and that other person, they need to apologize as well, because you've just lost your maturity within it. It's like the ability to identify that and go, actually, this is worth an apology, if not to them, because maybe I don't speak to them, they don't want to speak to me, at least to myself.
Yeah,
because I need to let myself free of understanding that isn't me. That's an action that I did.
Yep. And
this is where I think a lot of people, and we go back onto a conversation we had just before the podcast about your response to was it a poem that you wrote? No,
there's a poem that a woman named Carmel wrote. It was on Talkback Radio, ABC.
Yeah.
And it was in response to Eurydice Dixon's murder in Melbourne. Yeah. And so this woman, a psychologist, I think she was, she wrote a poem about this whole gender narrative and how men always seem to get upset and very defensive when these things happen. And, you suddenly have all the hashtags, hashtag not all men, hashtag this isn't me. And her point in the poem was, you guys get upset about this, but nobody talks about the victim. It always gets turned around and focused back on the men because you think you're being attacked and it's not about you. And I thought about that for a couple of weeks, and I actually penned a poem back to her in response. And I said, look, I've given this some thought, and I could never imagine what it is like to be a woman in today's world. I have spoken in what I do now with a lot of women of across age groups about, what it is and how they see the world as a threat environment because of the bullshit stuff that men do. But it's the use of this term men. When you say men, you are absolutely talking about me because I am a man. Mm-hmm. What it needs, though, is then recognition by blokes like me that when you're asking me to change my behaviour, you're asking me to stand up and sort of be a man and call out the bad behaviour and, stand up for others, irrespective of what gender it is. But also understand that men, there is not a switch that suddenly lights on at a certain age with, a gender that is born with, the old bag of fruit.
Yeah.
Men are grown, just like any other person in society, and they're grown by a society to be a certain way by the influences they get. be it parenting, be it school, be it media, be it the movies, the games, everything that they get, where they get told they need to be a certain way, and then they get that certain way, and then they're suddenly told, well, everything that is bad. And then you just need to fix yourself. So in the poem, I went back and I said, look, it takes a village to raise a child, and we just need to be a more responsible village. If we want to grow guys, men that are, more responsible adults, more mature adults at a certain stage, then we need to go right back to basics. And we need to help them be that, not tell them, suck it up, don't cry, don't cry, be a man, be
but
strong,
don't be too
be
much
hard.
of a man. Like, it's all sorts of stuff.
It's
and
all that.
I think the biggest thing about this, and I haven't framed it into this conversation yet, but clearly you and I know this. This isn't about, hey, ladies, don't forget us men, and, men have it so tough, and, you ladies, it's nothing at all. It's going, for us to continue to move forward as a generation, as a whole race, not individual races, as a collective, we have to undersee ourselves as a collective. And so when something like Eurydice's situation happens, yes, it hurts the collective, and we as men have to stand up and go, this isn't good enough, and we have to be very much with along the lines of that. And this is one of the issues, I suppose, that I haven't talked about it yet. I haven't verbalized it, and which means I'm thinking as I'm talking right now, or all the way around. But it's like when I see feminists put this information forward, but then there's information over here for men that it's like, hang on a sec, what about this? It's like, you say you're for equality, then let's talk about equality all over. I'm all for talking about the issues with this, and I want to stand up, make sure that we can create as many positive male role models as we can. Like, that's 100%. We have to then make sure that in order to do that, we can't bash men into that. No. It won't work. And in fact, I fear that it will do worse. And so what we need to do is celebrate masculinity, as opposed to calling it toxic masculinity. Now, there is a variation of that, for sure. And I think I mentioned at the start of this, or before we got on this rather, that I came across a post on social media, which there is many posts on social media, which was it was actually a Facebook page, and they do a lot of blogging. I actually liked this stuff for a while, but after this, I'm like, I can see what's happening. I can see the underlying conversation that's happening here now. And it was 5 examples of non-toxic masculinity written by a female. And I'm like, 5 examples of non-toxic masculinity? Like, that's called masculinity. Right? I was saying to someone today, a different subject, and I'm like, but to me that sounds like, I'll have the chicken schnitzel, no Cheetos, please. It's like, doesn't fucking come with Cheetos. Right? Don't say that. Just ask for the schnitzel. Ask for healthy masculinity, as opposed to calling it non-toxic. And I'm like, this is the issue, is that we see with conversations like this, I understand the premise, and maybe the intent's really positive, right? However, it presupposes that the norm is toxic masculinity.
Absolutely.
Or that masculinity is toxic.
Yes.
And it's like, this is the whole issue. It's not.
No.
It's absolutely beautiful in the most masculine way, in the same way that the feminine is. And if we go too far one way, it's not good. And if we go too far the other way, it's not good. And so it's sort of looking at this and going, the conversation that clearly we're having, and I have a lot, is about the collective. And it's about the collective because I grew up with 3 older sisters. I lived with my mum most of my life, like growing up. My dad and her split up when I was 8. And then mum's partners were abusive and alcoholics and all that sort of stuff. I learned, I was old enough, thank God I was old enough to realise that's not the way you act. Right? But to think that didn't have carryover to how I acted as early 20s and probably even today would be delusional. And so it's continually understanding, and this is one of the biggest things I've learnt, if not this year, in the last 12 months, it's about unbecoming who I'm not. Right.
That's an interesting phrase, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So it's like, hang on a sec, I'm not this. I need to unbecome that. I'm not emerging. I am exactly as I am today. I'm not waiting for success just around the corner. I'm not waiting for someone to come and, hey, here's your masculinity award, now you're a man. I'm not waiting. I don't have to do that. I'm exactly as I am, and I don't have to do all these sorts of things. And it ties back into the identity of, like, someone will go, I'm angry. It's like, no, you're not. You're experiencing anger. You're a human. You're not an emotion. And we need to be able to identify that as something that I'm experiencing rather than I am and I am embodying.
It's also a key part of having a conversation, and it is a conversation, and you can't have a conversation if you're trying to shut down a participant in that conversation by using terms that silences them. It's also taking the emotion out. And when we see a lot of these responses to these narratives and these conversations that are being had in the media and whatever, on Facebook, social media, a lot of it is emotive. And you can't have a logical conversation when the emotions are involved. And I think part of growth is that part of learning to reflect on how you came to be where you are, all those influences that are there, start to understand you as an individual, you as a person, your motivators, your triggers, all that sort of stuff. And once you gain that self-knowledge, I think until then can you really then start to have logical conversations where the first offense isn't defense. Yeah, when guys, I said, I talked to a group of 80 odd year 10s last week, and we talked about this point. It was the impact of men on the world as women see it. How do I know the world as women see it? I've talked to a lot of women. How do you see the world? And it really is seen a lot as a threat environment for them, for very good reason. Not just the criminal side of things, but just the bonehead things that guys do and have done.
Sure.
I said, after we've had this chat today, go and talk to your mother, your sister, your auntie, your cousin, and just ask them in a genuine way, how do you actually see the world? Start to learn about your environment and how you impact on that, so that you can then start making some real grown-up decisions on how you want to be a positive influence in that world, rather than sit back, be a passive participant, and then get all upset when somebody says something against you, and you're going, whoa, hang on a second, hashtag not all men,
Yeah, well, if you're going to be hashtag not all men, then make sure you're not all men.
Yeah.
That's causing the issues, and be a part of this, I don't think solution is the right term, but be a part of a more progressive movement towards a positive role model.
Positive role model in a greater humanity, because, you and I talked before about all these discussions, of course, along gendered lines. Men are more violent, women are not. Well, yes, so somebody finds an example, well, no, women are violent because, look at this example, well, women are violent. Well, yeah, but men are more violent. It becomes a competition.
Yeah. So
and what we really want to sort of break that down to is more a case of what are the basis of human relationships?
Yeah.
If we take away the gendered side, maybe then we stop talking about, we can actually address the real problem, which is how do we as human beings deal with our emotions and the outcome of those emotions, anger, aggression, anxiety, depression, violence, all these sorts of things. And then how can we start to teach those things as part of, to use your words from before, this rite of passage for people as they grow up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting as well, like looking at the aggression, the violence thing, is that I think if you grab the 100 most aggressive people, like in a population, 60 of them will be men, 40 of them will be female, right? The thing is, though, is that no matter where you do that, just about no matter where you do that, the most aggressive is male.
Yeah.
And it's like so at the peak, yes, but as a broad statement, we're all human, and we embody all of these emotions and capabilities. And this is one of the biggest things. It's like anger isn't bad. And I know we're on the same page. We're not even on the same page. It's the fucking page.
Yeah.
It's like anger is emotion. How can social media, I think, is a very, very unique thing, and we're in a very good time because we get to communicate a message. We also then have to be very careful about how we interpret the messages that we see on Facebook and social media platforms.
Absolutely.
And so that's because there's two faults to this. And one of them around that is going, well, everything's filtered, so I have to be happy. It's like, no. Sadness isn't bad. It's not negative. It's a normal human emotion that's pointing at something that's really important. So what is it giving you awareness of? It's the same as anxiousness, right? And I say that rather than anxiety for a whole range of reasons, but we feel anxious. So what is that pointing at? And sometimes it's actually pointing at your potential. Otherwise, you wouldn't get anxious about it. But it's also understanding that's not bad. It's very interesting. It doesn't mean that you don't feel good about it. Of course, if I was like, you got 2 minutes, you want to be happy or anxious? It's like, I'll probably take happy.
Yeah.
Thank you. But anxiousness is important, and that's the crucial thing of it. And don't let social media make you think otherwise. And the other aspect of that is that for a long time, for me to get news, or any of us to get news, it was in the newspaper.
Yep.
And it was also, if it wasn't in the newspaper, it would be at 6 p.m. at night, half hour, local news, 6:30 or whatever time it was for national news. And that was it. So when something happens, I can see news 24 hours a day shared by multiple people. So my brain picks up on it more, saying it's happening way more. And it's like, sort of, it's happening. That's bad enough. Let's talk about that. But if we're going to talk about that, let's talk about the whole thing and make sure that we're providing a safer space for every single person to be in.
I think the thing that adds to that too is we've created a fearful society, fearful, anxious, whichever way you want to put that, and it's part of that 24/7 media cycle, but it's also part of consumerism. It's this idea that there's a threat out there all the time, and therefore if you allow the government to do this, you'll be fine. If you allow a marketeer to do this, you'll be fine. This idea that you can't be happy unless you look like this, own this, have this, whatever that. And you're bombarded with this. So we have generations now of folk who have been in the receipt of that message, but never been taught how to be mature consumers of the message, i.e. how to be critical analysts of that message and understand where the message is bullshit, where they're being manipulated by the message for whatever reason, be it marketing or be it political, it doesn't matter. And so you have people who are more anxious, more fearful, haven't been taught how to deal with those emotions in a proper way, and therefore are much more likely to strike out in a counterproductive way, physically, emotionally, however, than I think we were before. Now, I was brought up in a culture where you handled everything. As a man, you handle everything, even women, everybody. It was about stiff upper lip. It was straighten your tie, carry on, and that had its own dangers. But I think we've gone too far the other way, and I think that's part of the problem. It goes back to this idea of building in self-awareness, building in self-knowledge, building in the capability to self-reflect, to then allow you to start to think about how you're going to react to that in a better way. Rites of passage is a big one. We don't have them.
No.
We have hey, happy 18th, woohoo, you're now an adult.
Yeah.
Well, the human brain doesn't finish in developing till your mid-20s. So, where is this line of adult? Now you're going to throw all these responsibilities on you. Whereas in the old days, you would have certain gateways that you had to pass through, whether it was running out and spending a week out in the jungle by yourself and being self-sufficient, or whatever the case might be, that were treasured and recognised. We in our culture don't have that, and people are therefore searching, I think, in ways to fill that gap. And when you start searching for ways to fill that gap, when you don't have positive role models, when you don't have a tight network that supports you around that, you end up trying to look for it in social media or movies, or the tough bloke who's selling drugs on the corner down the street.
Yeah, absolutely. What we end up seeing is a lot of adult males walking around with boy psychology.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a really good book that I read it's probably one of my most recommended books, and it's called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, The Four Archetypes of the Mature Masculine, by a guy called Robert Moore and another guy called Douglas Gillett. They're both Jungian psychologists, and so they talk about the archetypes of masculinity effectively. Now there's more, but they're the four they go into, and those four have shadows. So for example, a king is just a centered individual that's able to make decisions that's the betterment for himself and the people around him, right? And funnily enough, the magician sits at the bottom of the graph, because it's the gut that feeds the wisdom to the king to be able to make the decisions, etc., etc., etc. But the king, for example, has an inflated king, which is a shadow, which is the tyrant, and then an isolated king, which is the weakling. And this book was one of the first books that I read that allowed me to be like, right, I don't have rites of passage. Right, okay, that's interesting. And then it got me this understanding of like, well, hang on a sec, how do I become an actual man? Like, just because I'm older doesn't necessarily mean I'm a man, and something about me doesn't fit right with that as well. So, right, okay, I've got some searching to do. What does it mean to be a man to me? And where have I done wrong in the past that shows that those stages I wasn't in my true manlyhood, right? And the other book that I read that was very interesting was another book by a psychologist called Robert Augustus Masters, To Be a Man. And that book pulled me apart. It was one of the things that was just like, fuck, right, okay. It was I had to have a break of reading that kind of shit after that, because I was like, it's just like pulling myself, my psyche, and like it's just like, it was rough. And I'm like, I remember sitting there, I was just exhausted, because I'm reading, and then I would apply it back to myself and bring up memories and look at these situations and how I think of stuff, and I'm like, God damn it, I'm like, there is no rites of passage. And the reason why we need to continue to have these conversations is so that we can enable other young men to be able to understand that there is hope for their ability to own more responsibility. And what I mean by that is that we don't become man by rejecting responsibility.
No.
We become more of ourself by accepting it and moving through that, I believe, and also acknowledging that in other men.
And I think this is a key thing, and we have similarities there, although different paths. Is we've come to a time where we have had to, or we've wanted to, deconstruct ourselves and look deep inside that mess and start, poking around the innards to see who we really are, what all the bits and pieces that make us up. And if I saying myself, I think that takes a lot of courage to do so, and you have to be ready to do it. But until you get that deep self-knowledge that understands all that, I think it becomes much harder then to rebuild yourself in the way that you want to be, the man. And to me, a man is somebody that, I don't even think it needs to be a man. A mature human being is someone that is willing to use all their gifts, all their talents, all their resources to lift somebody else up, to help somebody along the way, not to better their own position or elevate themselves above others. That's not maturity. That's nothing.
Yeah.
But to use all that, and this has got nothing to do with spirituality. I think it's just humanity, to lift somebody else up. And maybe that's the rite of passage, that act of sitting down and squirreling through all these innards, the deconstruction phase, to be able to be reconstructed, bigger, better, faster, whatever. But sometimes I think, I did some of that with guidance. I did a lot of it in the same way you've done, reading and sitting back and going, so how does that apply to me? And shit, I wasn't thinking about that, and that suddenly come up in my head, and okay, memories that I'd suppressed for many, many years,
or memories that I thought had no significance.
Yeah,
it's like, well, why did I remember it then?
Yeah,
and it was so fascinating, something like that, where it's like, oh, I remember that. Then I sort of sit there for a minute, and I'm like, oh fuck, and I start to feel a bit sick about it. And I'm like, oh god, that means it's probably true. And it's just like, right, okay, well, I got to go camping now and look at the stars for a while and figure this shit out.
Well, and that's the other thing you need to understand too about memories, that memory is a volatile thing, and that is another thing. When a memory that you have, you suddenly realise, oh, it didn't happen that way at all. That actually, okay, if I think about that some more, I was actually the protagonist there. I wasn't the victim in that particular case, or, for example, when I was in my 20s, as I said, I was working security in St Kilda, in Melbourne, and I got the Navy censured me for that. I got investigated for homosexuality, drug abuse, and consorting with known criminals, because all those things were bad in those days. Clearly, drugs and criminals were, but so is, funny enough, homosexuality, or not funny enough as a case might be.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, so this was mid-80s.
Mid-80s, right? Yeah.
So it was still illegal in the Navy at that time. To be homosexual, and I lost my security clearance. I was pushed out to the outer for a while, and I thought, I was 25, 26 years old, that I was really badly done by. I look back now with an older head on my shoulders, and I see how much the Navy took care of me at that point in time. They could have thrown me to the wolves. They could have thrown me out. My career could have been over. My life would have been much different to the way it was. So it's that thing about how you go back and you look at that memory and you see it in a whole different light. But you have to do that to be able to then gain that knowledge. If you don't, you're going to be ignorant forever.
Yeah. it also becomes part of a story, right?
Mm.
And that story, once again, it's interesting talking about memories. And one of the hardest things, I think, out of any development that I've sort of delved into and in my own self, with a capital S when I say self, was going, well, this is what I remember. And then I had to learn that doesn't mean that's what happened.
Exactly. Yep.
You know, it's like, no, but I remember. It's
Yep.
like, yeah, but we have filters over those memories.
Yep.
And like, it's like, I remember the time, I remember where the sun was, I remember this. And it's like, yep. And all you could do was see it with your filters from your point of view.
Yep.
And it was a snapshot in motion. You're not aware of the things that occurred in that person's life prior to that moment occurring that would have influenced it, let alone yourself, etc., etc., etc. And understanding that made me realize, well, like, I'm a terrible witness. it's like I'm a terrible witness to my own life. It's like I've created these things and put meaning on it.
Yep.
So not only is there a memory, I've laid a level of meaning on that memory,
Yep.
and then I'm like, that's what that means.
Yep.
And so then, sure enough, I realized that I'd grab that memory and the meaning, and then I'd project into the future. I'm like, it's going to happen again.
Yep.
And sure enough, it would.
Yep.
Why would it? Because I'd fucking make sure it did.
Self-actualization. Yep.
Yep. And that's the question. You go to someone, it's like, do you do any visualization? They're like, nah. And I'm like,
Yeah.
do you worry? They're like, yeah, I worry. It's like, yeah, you're just visualizing what you don't want.
Yeah.
It's the same
Yeah.
shit. You know,
So, with respect to then this, we're talking about masculinity, and I'm with you. I don't like the idea of this word toxic masculinity, because it ties the two things together, and automatically it's a bad thing.
I suppose that, just to clarify on that before you continue, doesn't mean that there isn't levels of toxic masculinity or unhealthy masculinity. Maybe.
Let's call it unhealthy,
Yeah.
because I think you're right. And unhealthy masculinity is, let's talk about aggression.
Okay.
Yep. We have a narrative that says male aggression is a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we celebrate male aggression on our sporting fields.
Yep.
We celebrate it on the footy field.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a young man who's being told male aggression is a terrible thing, watching tens of thousands of people cheering every weekend as, bunches of males run around their field of their choice, bashing into each other, unless, of course, it's round ball, which they just fall down a lot. And everybody's going, yay, that's really great. Or boxing, or, the
Sure.
contact sports. So they don't get the message that aggression is a male trait that can actually be a very positive one and has been used in eons gone past. Males tended to have the role of protector. Males tended to be the ones that got sent out to fight wars. And I was listening to an interesting conversation today on ABC Radio, actually, about a woman who's born in the 50s, and she was talking about how so close after war her mother was becoming a very independent woman, because during the war all the men were all fighting, so the women were required to step up, and the women were required to go into the factories and to take over a lot of what were traditional male roles, and suddenly went, shit, I can do this. I'd always been told or trained or thought that I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a point in time when those sort of roles changed, but the reason they changed was that men were out fighting wars. Mm-hmm. So that aggression was celebrated.
Well, it's also, if aggression is, and obviously we're going to expand on this, I think we've got both interesting points to add to it. Aggression was often how we ate.
Absolutely, yes.
Because if there wasn't a level of aggression, we didn't actually kill, therefore we didn't eat.
Yeah.
Like it's a biological part of that, so therefore it's useful as long as we use it. But yeah, please continue.
There's much less aggression required to catch a lettuce than it was to catch a leopard, sort of thing,
Yeah.
So we have these ideas that, aggression is toxic. No, it's not. Aggression is bad. No, it's not. It's how we learn to use that aggression in an appropriate way. Josh Tonner, he's a Australian. Yep,
Time bomb.
So Josh helps me out with some of the programs I deliver, and we talk about aggression with the young lads that we talk to. And I asked Josh, I say, mate, do you fight outside the ring? He said, no.
Mm-hmm.
Got nothing to prove. I don't have to prove anything.
Mm-hmm.
I fight inside the ring. How do you feel about the guy you're fighting? You're spending 3-minute rounds, whatever it is, kicking the absolute bejesus out of each other. How do you feel about the guy you're fighting? Do you hate him? No, I actually respect him.
Mm-hmm.
I respect his skills, and this is, it's not unusual for us to finish a fight and one guy wins, the other guy learns, which is, I love that saying of his, you either win or you learn.
Mm-hmm.
And we go out and have a beer.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a totally appropriate time for aggression. for might, for fighting, and that's in a ring.
Mm.
And then there's a totally inappropriate place, and that's at the bar. I said, if somebody came up to you at a pub and said, "Oh, you're that Josh Tonner bloke. I guess you reckon you're pretty good. You want to go, mate?" Josh would walk out of the bar.
Yeah.
You say, "Mate, I do my fighting in the ring. I've got nothing to prove to you."
Yep.
You know, and unless it comes down to self-defense, where the guy, actually stupid enough to let loose, then he doesn't need to do it.
Yeah.
So,
and there's your unhealthy rites of passage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the healthy rite of passage is that training, and this is where, the programs that I run, that we run at this organisation I work with called Men's Link, is all about trying to help guys navigate those times and to tool them up with ways that they can do it. And I think we need more of it.
Yep.
If you want to have mature men in society, then it's society's role to grow them, not to build them a certain way, using all the, you need to look this way, be this way, act this way. And then when they get to that stage, decry the fact that they've turned out the way that they've been brought up to be. I was asked a question by a female acquaintance whose son was hitting their 15s and 16s. He's so non-communicative. Why doesn't he talk? I said, because he's been taught since toddler not to. Don't cry, be quiet, suck it up. We don't train our boys to cry. Now, I was talking to a young 15-year-old father of a 6-month-old child this week, and he said, how can I encourage my son to talk, to break out of this male stereotype? I said, role model what you want your boy to be. Watch the words that you say. That one sentence, don't be a girl. That one sentence embeds itself in that young boy's brain and colours his perception of not only himself but females. So be careful of what you say. If you want your son to be emotive, if you want your son to talk to you about stuff, talk to him about stuff. Tell him how you hurt. Why are you crying? Oh, it's nothing. No, I'm crying because, mum's just died, or because the dog's just... I'm crying because of this, and crying is a human emotion, and this is just, this is all real, and this is all fine. So small examples of how we can all, in a societal way, start to role model the type of young bloke that we want to build into a young man that is then going to be the sort of guy that goes, mate, that's not what you said there, that's bloody bullshit. How would you like it if I talked to your sister or your mum like that?
Yep.
Or just go, mate,
it's not on.
Be a human being, dude.
Yeah.
Respect others. Treat others the way you want to be.
Yeah. It's interesting how there seems to be, I don't know, I'm not a fan of a lot of the media conversations. I find it difficult to not see a layer of or undertone in their messages. And one of those sort of things there, I suppose, is like the messages that they're portraying is often... Well, it's misleading, right? And this is the same. I mean, this ties into like the obesity epidemic we're in. It's like, no, we're not in an obesity epidemic. This is just another example. We're in a misinformation, mass marketing epidemic.
Yes.
So we've got to be able to look at this information and critically look at it, right? Critically look at it, and the obviously the undertone of our conversation is about having more positive role models, and that's not going to stop things like the having a Eurydice like that tomorrow. That's not going to happen, and it's a horrible thing, and we want to be able to do that. But it's about making sure that the next generation have a solid understanding of what we talked about emotional intelligence. Look at the first two letters in the word intelligence. Emotional intelligence is not about my understanding of you.
No,
it's about my understanding of me.
Yeah.
And so I suppose bring the point back around. It's understanding this constructed idea of masculinity is bad, aggression is bad, anger is bad, but here's all these things you should be fearful of, by the way, and also if you buy this product, then that'll get rid of it, and then also this is bad and that is bad. So it's like, get rid of the fucking TV for one.
Yep.
Like that's the biggest thing, and one of the biggest things I suppose I learned was obviously I read a lot, I listen to a lot of psychologist stuff around that, I find it fascinating, but it gave me an opportunity to find mentors in different eras.
Yep.
right, through whether it be philosophy, through to 19th century psychologists, all sorts of stuff that gave me this plethora of information that I could carve out my own understanding of what is good, true, and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, it allowed me to realize my own shortcomings and be curious about them rather than judgmental of them.
Yep.
And this is my actual thing about long form audio at the moment, is that I remember speaking to one of my clients, and he's late 40s, and he said in his during his mother's lifespan, the biggest advancement that she had was the fridge. And I was like, yeah, I sort of laughed at it, but I'm like, that's really
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, we can save food.
Yes.
So the whole each dinner, finish your dinner, you won't get dessert. Finish, right? Came from this era of the depression, so to speak, where we had to eat it because otherwise it will go to waste.
Yep.
Don't waste your dinner.
Yep.
So how many people are walking around today with advice from 1920? That's the question that's worth asking.
Yeah.
And it made me think about the biggest advancement in my lifetime. And, I haven't seen 80, 85 years of life, clearly. I've only seen 29 and a half, just to clarify. Round that up. But my whole point there was going, well, the internet is clearly one of them. But what specifically about the internet? Otherwise, you'd say electricity. So what specifically about the internet? And I'm like, probably long-form audio. And the reason why I'd say long-form audio or audio in general, and there's two reasons. One is because I can now can consume one book a week.
Yep.
By washing the dishes and driving to work.
Yep.
There's not a time in the world ever that I could consume information that's interesting, that allows me to grow and understand more. People go, oh, but I got to take notes. It's like, no, you don't. You don't take notes on the TV, and you're fearful of it every today, tonight. Like it's,
that voice, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. Lyrics
Tune
to
in.
songs. Yeah, that's right. This poor the battler. But words to songs you don't like, so your brain's picking it up. Let's be honest about that. So that's one. But two, it offers us the opportunity to be able to pull difficult things apart, and that takes time, right? And that's where it's like on a news segment, we've got 5 minutes, and that's it. If you're lucky, that's a big segment.
But I think that's part of the change too. Is that once upon a time, there was more in a news segment. So the pulling apart was done by the newspaper or the investigative journalist who would do investigative journalism. We still see some of it, but nowhere near what it used to be.
No.
We see, the people who are primarily on our news screens are entertainers almost. They're just a talking head for a script that's written by somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there used to be more thought put into those programs, whereas these days I call it intellectual bubblegum. It just fills the airwaves and there's nothing, it blows up and there's a mess all over your face, but you've actually achieved nothing for the chewing. Thank you very much. The accessibility of all that information then requires the capability for analytical thought. The ability to say, and forget about what is fake from what is real. I mean, my job in the Navy was all about processing information, sorting the wheat from the chaff, the real from the fake, and then giving the person I was supporting an idea of this is what's happening, this is going to happen type of information.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that we encourage that sort of learning. I keep getting back to what you're doing is self-driven, and again, it takes a lot of courage to be able to break this stuff apart, to see your own shortcomings and then want to overcome them, rather than just be this passive consumer of this noise that's coming in. And as you say, half of it, more than half of it, is telling you, be scared. There's a crisis here. Everything's a crisis.
Yeah. And something that you don't know. This is, by the way, you don't know this. You've got to read this thing because you don't know it. It's like you're never going to be enough as long as you try and keep up. It's like...
I mean, to be honest, when I see a news report about a fire that dropped a building in, Bumfuck, Idaho, I'm sad for the people of Bumfuck, Idaho, but it's not news to me. Why do I care about that? Has no impact on my life whatsoever. But that's what news is, all this tragedy. And I sometimes, I don't think I'm a conspiracy theorist, but there is a certain benefit to keeping the population at a certain level of fear because they're able to be,
controlled.
bit better.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, like it's just, yeah, for sure. It's interesting around conspiracy theories. It's just like, why is it called a conspiracy theory? It's like, well, because the mainstream media didn't tell us that's what happened. It's like, right, so that makes it should it just be a theory?
Yeah.
The other thing, though, is that you look at stuff like the public school system, and the public school system, I mentioned this thing in my last podcast, was set up to create obedient workers.
Yes.
And that was probably a really good idea at the time. And I mean that in the sense of, like, there was this idea of, like, well, why don't we just teach them how to use the tools that we're creating, and so that way they can have a better standard of living. It's like, that's a fucking great idea. And now today, it's like everyone's in lines, make sure we all wear the same thing. Everyone's a special snowflake. Why is your shirt untucked? Tuck it in like everyone else. Right? And just, you should really learn to be yourself. No, not like that.
Yeah, not that. Yourself the way that we want you to be yourself. And it doesn't, and there's where the, the body language isn't matching the verbal language. The verbal language is saying that, the body language is going, no, the hands are up. No. We want people who are innovative. We want people who are creative. We want people who are this, but you need to sit down and do this test so we can get your NA plan score, so we can keep numbers and figures and whatever. And if you don't fit in, well, that's too bad, mate, and you're lost. I talk to the young fellas, I deal a lot with kids who are considered at risk by the school because they've disengaged or something. And I say, guys, school's important, only insofar as you need to be able to read and write. Math, maybe. But you need to be able to communicate. And to do that, you need to be able to read and write. Beyond that, crikey, there are tons of successful people out there who never finished school. They found a passion and they followed that passion. They worked hard for it and they became, your Richard Bransons and a whole bunch of other blokes. In fact, even recently I met a young guy in his mid-30s who left school in his mid-teens, can't read well, and has created a very, very successful business out of just sheer street smarts, if you like, natural talent and freaking hard work, and telling kids that you're no good because you don't fit that box is the same as telling, to get back on our main topic, a young fella, you're no good because you don't fit the man box, because you haven't got a six-pack, because you aren't muscled up, because you are too emotive, because you're too soft. That's as damaging to a bloke as, the other side.
It's really interesting, and one of the biggest things I learned was, in short, we seek love from the feminine and approval from the masculine. And so if the father or the father figure's idea of being a man is unhealthy, we don't want to be a man, we want approval, so we'll become the man that's unhealthy. And that's where it's like being really mindful of that. And I'm very fortunate. I have a good relationship with my father, and he is a good man. He definitely got angry. He's very calm though, but he did get angry. I remember him hitting a wall once, and that was kind of it, right? But he was like, I'm not putting up with this, and out he went. And it was sort of understanding that I was lucky enough that I was old enough to see that and see behaviour as that. And then as I got a bit older and saw the other side of the fence, and I'm like, that doesn't mean at that age I was like, oh, okay, that's not, you're not allowed to do that. I remember being a 10-year-old boy just standing there watching my mum be abused. I couldn't do anything. Why do you think I created this facility? Right, to help 40-year-old females get stronger. Like when that realization came, I'm like, fuck, Jesus, I never thought of that. That was actually what's going on, but I somehow turned my pain into some sort of purpose. And it's interesting that when we can continue having conversations like this, that are raw and honest and full of epiphanies and understandings, and clearly you and I have our own developments that we're still both working through, because there's no finish line. But the whole idea is that to be able to support other men to be men. Well,
and that's the key thing is, we keep being told or asked to change behaviour, and I think this is what these sort of discussions do. Is it's not about being a bad bloke and having to be a good bloke. It's actually about good blokes helping other blokes be good blokes. And I don't think that's being too egotistical again. I mean, I've worked frickin' long and hard to be a bloke that I'm happy with. I give my young guys that I teach a choice of 5 I use the Navy values in these programs. Honour, honesty, courage, integrity, and loyalty. Pick one and let this guide you for this program. Whether it guides you in life is it's not as important as you adopt a value, a positive value that you can then, that guides you in what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And, mine is honour, and I like to think of myself as an honourable person and, dealing with people in an honourable way. That's what I continue to strive for. Just one point, though, on we're talking about the negative aspects of masculinity that, that popped into my head, is that it's not just men that suffer from this. I've seen a lot of women in the workplace adopt what were traditionally masculine traits because they believed they had to be that way to succeed in the workplace. So it's almost like, this idea that to succeed you have to use these negative aspects of masculinity rather than some of the feminine aspects, compassion, support of others, those sort of things, the more nurturing elements, which I found to be much more useful when I was a manager, to help other people, rather than the, you will do this, I'm going to rip your head off and shoot down your neck type stuff. So I think it's that conversation is the one that also needs to continue to be had, is this idea that we have all these traits. Some are deemed feminine, some are deemed masculine. Let's just do away with it. I mean, is it maybe time that we even forget about these concepts of masculinity and femininity and just go with humanity? A humanity that has some really good characteristics and it's got some shitty ones that we can work on, and we can maybe teach people to, or help people to avoid. Yeah. Focus more on the good ones.
It's an interesting question, and like my makeup is understanding that humanity is made up of masculine and femininity, right? And then there's a balance of both, and neither is good nor bad.
Yep.
But one thing I'm certain of is that the exclusion of one is bad.
Yes.
Right. But the integration of it isn't.
No.
It's healthy, and so it's only when we actually exclude one or the other. Right, and often, let's say the people that are really fighting masculinity don't realize how masculine it is.
Yes,
it's like you're fighting something that you are right now. Yeah. And I'm not trying to be like, ha. It's just like, so how do we go about this, and how can we integrate it, and how can we have a healthier society because of it? And so it's really is a profound and paradoxical like situation that it's like, where's the finish line? And I don't know where the finish line is, but I'm happy to stumble forward to a better place.
Well, it's I think worth remembering that the way society has developed, even over the past 60, 70 years, that traditional, you look at the 50s role model of mum in an apron with 2 kids beside her working in the kitchen, dad in a suit going off to work, he's the provider, mum's the homebody. How that's changed in the space of 60 years.
Yeah.
In the history of mankind, that's a freaking short period of time. And whilst I know we have a, instant gratification society these days, we need to recognise the progress that we're making as much as, and maybe celebrate that more than the progress we've yet to make. And as I say, take the emotions out, look at it a little, and emotions are always going to be there, but try at least to look at it a bit more logically and a bit more collegiately, and we might make better progress than we have to date.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I think we just started a conversation. I'll probably ask to get you back on another time if that's okay with you.
Thanks, Dave. Always happy to talk.
Mate, absolutely. Now, where do you recommend young men, or for example women, listen to this to point, or any men, should I say, not just young, to point men who probably need a bit more support?
So clearly, I work for Men's Link here in Canberra, and we focus on young guys 10 to 25. We provide a mentoring service for the 10 to 18 years old. We provide counselling for 10 to 25, and then the school programs that we present, we follow, again, the 10 to 18s. So menslink.org.au, if you like. I'll put a plug in there for us. Local Canberra charity, we do a lot of stuff, and all that stuff we do is free to the clients. If you're in the over 25 category, I think Everyman here in Canberra is a really good resource. And of course, the standard Beyond Blue, Black Dog Institute, and of course In Extremis, in times of real need, Lifeline, are all resources. The other one is I often get asked, by single mums, how do I get a decent male role model into my son's life? I got to tell you, since I started, I'm in the powerlifting community now for just over 4 years, and I found it the most supportive at least with the guys I know.
Yeah.
You, John Sheridan, Andy Lance, Dan DeKiss down there on South Coast, Mitch Pike over there in Metamorph, and others, Benny down in Ex-Unbranded. There are some great male role models amongst those blokes.
Absolutely.
And if you're in our community as a single mum or a mum who needs a positive male role model for their young fella, I think you could do a lot worse than have a chat to one of the guys, in that community and say, hey, my son's struggling with this, would you mind having a chat with him?
Yeah.
And if you feel comfortable with that bloke, then, that's a probably pretty good guide.
Yep, I think that's a fantastic point. Absolutely. I 100% vouch for that.
Thanks, mate.
Indeed, mate. Thank you very much. Until
next time.
Indeed. Cheers, mate.
Cheers, mate.